Welcome back to Annie Makes Art School. Today's subject is composition, which is another big one, so I'm going to tackle as much as I can in today's session, but feel free to drop questions in the comments, and I'll definitely be doing a part 2, as well as probably parts 3, 4, and who even knows. So we're going to get started today with just some of the core principles of composition. I'm going to give some examples from my own work, and we're going to give a little homework assignment for anyone who's interested to try out applying some of these ideas to their own work. As always, I give the disclaimer at the beginning of this video that anything I share is just my opinion and things that I've found that work for me. But very little in art has an absolute right or wrong, so take from this what you like and leave the rest behind. Let's get started. Before we dive into the various charts and diagrams that I prepared to discuss composition today, I think it's important to establish what composition even is. A basic definition would be that composition is the way you lay out the elements of your piece within the page or the frame or the canvas or whatever surface you're working on. So if, for example, we consider the view that we're looking at right now to be our page or our canvas, and me to be the subject matter, there's going to be a very different composition if I'm sitting centered like this, looking straight towards camera, versus if I'm very close up and to the side, if the camera's high or low, in focus, out of focus. All of these elements and more contribute to what the composition of your piece is. One of the best known concepts of composition is the rule of threes. This is the idea that if you divide your image up into 3 equal pieces, you're always going to have a more pleasing composition using one of the distant thirds as opposed to the center third. So for example, instead of having a piece where our 3 images here, which we're using a triangle, a circle, and a square to keep it simple, are all stacked right in the center of the page, I could instead put them all in the lower third of the image or in the higher third of the image. Either one of these is going to create a more interesting and engaging composition than that center one. The same can apply in opposite thirds. So instead of having all of mine stacked right in the center vertically, I could also have them off to the right side or off to the left side. An important thing to discuss on this is that I don't actually consider the rule of thirds to be a rule. I consider it to be a really valuable tool, meaning that if you look at a lot of art, even wonderful, beautiful, historically accepted masterpieces sometimes break this theoretical rule, meaning you can sometimes have a portrait that wants to be dead center in the frame to give a sense of intensity, or you might have a landscape that's perfectly centered through the middle to give an eerie sense of stillness. Generally, compositions that are perfectly centered are a little uncomfortable for the audience to look at, but that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. Sometimes you want your audience to be uncomfortable, to feel confronted, to feel focused. It doesn't even necessarily have to be a negative feeling, it's just going to be intense. If we take this idea and apply it to portraits, it's the difference between having that very intense, straight at you portrait, almost like something out of a yearbook, versus one that's going to be a little more off to the side. It's going to be a more engaging composition. In this case, I've placed the face higher on the page in the top third, and I've placed the body off to the right third. This is going to be a much more pleasing to look at image. However, this one is going to be probably more striking. The same applies, as I mentioned, to our landscapes. It's the difference between having a very centered image that's going to feel almost a little bit eerie or maybe naive, as opposed to a landscape that maybe has elements broken up into higher and lower thirds and off to one side and the other. Up next, let's define some key terminology relating to composition. As a reminder, if you ever have difficulty reading the visuals that I have here, I'll be posting clearer images of them on my Instagram. My handle is AKSIEG after each video. An important concept to understand in composition is the idea of positive versus negative space. In the example of our circle, triangle, and square here, our positive space would be the objects themselves, the area that's been filled in black. Our negative space would be the blue portion of the page. Both the positive and negative space have their own sense of composition, how the objects relate to each other, how the negative space moves across the page. Both of these are important to understand and think about when planning your composition. One of my favorite examples of playing with positive and negative space is the fadeaway girl. If you aren't familiar with this illustration technique, I highly suggest doing a quick Google image search because it's absolutely beautiful. It was popularized many decades ago by an artist named Coles Phillips, and the idea was taking an illustration of a character, but then intentionally removing segments of the image to create negative space in a way that played with the sense of depth and reality and color. So I've actually done several versions of my own fadeaway girls I can give as demonstrations here. In both cases, the clothing worn by these girls has been removed entirely from the image, not leaving behind the bare skin underneath, but leaving behind the background. So the color that I have moving across the page just continues right through her, but by virtue of leaving that space in clean lines, your brain fills in for the artist the space that would be occupied by, in this case, a swimsuit, in this case, a sweater. This brings us to the concept of movement and flow. That's the idea that the artist can lay out their page in a way to specifically guide the eye across it in a certain order. In this case, the eye is being drawn from the top corner of the page around and down through the bottom. We can apply the same idea to our fadeaway girls I showed earlier. In this case, the way the paint has been laid out across the page actually starts our eyes in a lower corner and carries it in a diagonal across. In this example, the downward strokes as well as the sharp lines made by her arms bring the eye from the top corner down and through the very center bottom. Next, we're going to talk about rhythm, which can be a little bit of a confusing one, partially because it's a multifaceted element, meaning that it connects to your composition, your mark-making techniques, your subject matter, and a lot more. So in this case, I've used different styles of mark making. I've used pointillism with closer together dots in the background versus spread out ones in the foreground. And I've thought about the objects and their relation to each other in terms of the almost sort of tempo or musicality related to the piece. If we look at this piece, it's actually laid out very similarly to our top one. However, it has a completely different sense of movement across the page. This brings us to unity. Unity is the idea that images on your page can be laid out in a way that either gives a sense of belonging and connection or the exact opposite. So in our demonstration here, we have a lack of unity. Two of our objects are very similarly placed, similarly rendered, and then one object has a dramatically different color, a dramatically different placement, and a dramatically different size. When you look at this composition, there's no question that one of these things doesn't feel like it belongs with the others. That's not, again, necessarily a bad thing. If your goal is to illustrate a sense of isolation or separation, this is exactly what you want. If you're looking more to give a sense of peace and harmony in your piece, you would probably want that triangle to be more similarly rendered and to be placed around the other objects in a way that gives a nice flow to the eye. Next, let's discuss contrast. Contrast is placing two opposite things in the same composition to highlight each other's differences. So for example, in this image, there are two green objects and one bright pink one. By virtue of the difference of those colors, the eye is going to be drawn very strongly to that one bright pink object over the other two which share a similar color. This is also an example of controlling the balance of your piece. In this composition, I've used contrast of size, so I've got one object significantly larger than the other two, which is of course going to draw my focus to the larger piece. This is also an example of controlling proportions. Our third example of contrast is here, where even though these two pieces have different colors, they both share the same rendering system, meaning that they're fully filled in colors, while our third object is only outlined. Even though it has a color in common with this one, your focus is still going to be drawn to the square because it is the one with the biggest contrast between the other two images, also known as focus. The last concept I want to tackle before we start getting into application is angle and perspective. So for example, if we have a very simple illustration of a square, that is a perfectly fine composition if you want something simple and straightforward, but it starts getting a lot more interesting if we place the viewer at an angle that's going to give us a different sense of space in relation to that object. It's going to get even more interesting if we add almost a tone to it. In this case, I have placed the viewer lower down looking up at the square. It gives a sense that it is imposing or threatening. We're beginning to sense a narrative just by the placement of the viewer versus the object. This also applies if we have more than one object on the page in terms of how we look at their relationship to each other. In this case, I've placed the circle and the triangle right next to each other, again, a very flat composition that doesn't tell us very much about their dynamics relating to each other or the viewer. That changes as soon as I give a sense of depth in the piece and where they are in relation to each other. In this case, I'm already starting to establish a narrative. There's a sense of almost animosity between these two pieces, and I've placed the viewer on the circle's side. There's a sense that we are looking almost from behind it. If these were two characters, we're standing on this one's team, looking over their shoulder at this one. In this case, I've given us a bird's eye view of both of our two characters. And you'll notice I'm starting to call them characters because just by this layout, it's giving a sense of almost personality and interrelation between them. In this case, the viewer is more removed in that bird's eye view, more of a spectator than being on either one's team. So now that we understand our core concepts, let's apply them. This might be a little hard to see, especially my green in this lighting, but I've drawn our 3 shapes, I've tried to add a sense of different rhythm and contrast between them, and what I'm going to do now is use some extra pages to block out what our composition is going to be. So we in this case have a pre-rendered image. We're not planning out our composition in advance, but it's not too late to impact that composition. Meaning if this is a finished illustration, I can choose to crop it in a very simple way where I just place my edges kind of evenly around it. I can also choose to do an extreme crop where I'm having just the tiniest bit of each object visible in my illustration. In this case, you can't even really tell what the different objects are. You get only a glimpse of that triangle, but the bright pink draws your eyes to the top corner of the page. You could also choose to crop to completely remove one element and focus just on the other 2. You could choose to do a crop that's so tight you can't tell what any of the objects are and you just get a sense of texture. You could choose to take that original illustration and create an off-centered composition where we've created a large amount of negative space off to one side to give a sense of busyness and intensity on one side of the page and openness and quiet on the other. These are just a few examples of how I can crop after the fact to change the way that my image impacts my viewer. This brings us to our homework assignment for the week. I want you to find an existing piece of art that you're already happy with, and I want you to try and come up with as many different crops of it as you can to create different compositions. In this case, I've got my Godzilla attacking the city and my 2 brave vintage girls standing up against it. If I just crop this side of the page, I now have a very different story. I'm just looking at Godzilla wreaking havoc and there's no personal element by the girls. If I continue cropping even smaller and lower this page down, I've now taken Godzilla's eyes out of the composition. I can think about how that changes our personal connection to that character and changes the focus of where I'm looking on the image. I could even choose to crop down very small to where we don't even really get a sense of what the monster is, just the city and an understanding that something is going a little bit wrong. I could go to this side of the page and crop just the top section out. So I'm looking at these 2 girls in the cityscape. There's a sense that there's something chaotic happening off to the side and that they're standing up against it, but it's not even really clear what exactly is going on. My focus is entirely on their dynamics. There's an endless number of ways that we can crop our pages, but I want you to approach it just thinking about the different elements that we discussed today and how you can use them to gain control over the narrative of your piece. I hope you found this breakdown of concepts helpful. I know that today's session was a little bit more of a lecture than it was interactive. I hope down the line to be able to have more interactive composition sessions together, but I felt like it was important to first establish what these core concepts were. As always, feel free to drop any questions or concerns in the comments. I'm really excited to keep moving forward. I will be releasing Color Theory Part 2 later this week. Thanks, guys.